Good morning all, and welcome to this talk entitled Dream Machines and Walled Garden. It's a bit of a esoteric and cryptic title, but I'm going to tell you a story about one of IT's most important people that you might never have heard about. And it's a story that starts in Chicago in 1937 when Ted Nelson is born. His parents are Hollywood celebrities. His mother is Celeste Holm, an actress played in the Oscar-winning film Oklahoma. His father is Ralph Nelson. He's also a Hollywood personality. He's a director, also has won many Oscars, and this could be the start of a Hollywood fairy tale. Hollywood parents, the golden boy there, but this being Hollywood, his parents had not the best marriage you would expect, and custody of young Ted was transferred to his grandparents, Edith and Ted Holm Sr. So he was formally adopted by his grandparents, putting him in a very strange situation where his parents, legal parents, were also his grandparents. So he had sort of a displaced identity, separated from his birth parents and raised by someone who were not really his own. And his grandparents were also very different from his maternal parents. They were intellectuals. His grandmother was also a writer, and he grew up in a world filled with books. The shelves were full of classics, and you were not only encouraged to read, it was expected that you studied all of these things. So from his very early days, Ted Nelson lived his life inside a world of texts and had a very literary upbringing, giving him an idea that all texts are connected in some way or another. Him being a young child, he would not necessarily read all of the classics. He found an interest for science fiction books. These are some of his favorite titles. Ron Hubbard's Old Duck Methuselah. This was before he went totally nuts with the Scientology and all of that, which is a story about a doctor that travels across the universe healing people. The other one, The Typewriter in the Sky, was also one that made a big impression on him. It was a story about a person who heard the cranking sounds of typewriter, and his life would change as the story was written, as he went along. These were sort of inspiring stories to young Ted at the time that would later shape his life. But the most important one was The Voyage of the Space Beagle. This was a story about a crew traveling on a spaceship through the universe. And it was episodic, so for every single chapter, they would be in a new place and faced with a new challenge. So every person on board the spaceship was a specialist in their own field. And they would always have arguments about how do we solve this problem that we've bumped into. Now, there was one person on this spaceship that was something called a nexialist, that was a specialist in not one single field, but a specialist in mediating between different fields of knowledge. And this really inspired 11-year-old Ted to find out what his mission for life was. He wanted to become that nexialist. He did not want to specialize in any particular field. He wanted to know something about everything and be a person that brought everything together. And this was not only a small little teenage dream. He was so serious about this that he drew his own business card that he carried around and showed to people and said, "I'm Ted, I am a nexialist." And then people would, of course, ask him, what is that? Because this was a word made up in that book. But him growing up in this home, you would have magazines lying around on the dining room tables and so forth, and the family would sit down and read things from these magazines to each other. Like this one, the September 10, 1945 issue of Life magazine, which is a very special one, because inside this we find a classic essay by Vannevar Bush called As We May Think. Have any of you ever heard of this one before? Have you ever heard about Vannevar Bush before? Vannevar Bush is a towering scientific figure. He was the American President Roosevelt's chief scientific advisor during the Second World War. And he oversaw all of the science projects that went on through that time. Of course, all of them were very much focused at the war that was going on here in Europe. But this was not an essay about the scientific breakthroughs of the war. This was something that was looking towards the future, looking towards the world of peace and ways that technology and science could bring people together. And one particular thing that he drew on this page would get Ted's attention more than anything else. This is a machine that Vannevar Bush described called the Memex. It was a full desk that you could work on, but it was what was hidden inside the desk that was the real magic. Because inside the Memex, you would have a personal archive of knowledge and information stored on microfilm, which was the most advanced storage medium that we had at the time. But it was not only about recording information. They had these little buttons and levers that you could use to connect information together and create associative links. And Vannevar Bush's idea about this was that this Memex machine would not be hierarchical as information usually was. It would be associative like the human brain was. And about the same time, young Ted Nelson walked past a florist shop and he saw a sign outside that said, "Flowers by wire." And he did not read this as marketing. This was, of course, marketing for what is now known as Interflora. I saw a shop just down the road where you can walk into any florist and send flowers to someone at an entirely different location. He read the flowers by wire literally. And this set off thoughts in his mind about how does a thing like that work? What is the essence of a flower? And how could you do something like pick that apart and transfer it over a telephone wire or a radio signal or something like that? These are very strange thoughts for an 11-year-old boy to have, but he was thinking about the things that today we would call communications protocols. And this inspired his entire career, and he decided that he wants to study technology, arts and science, all of those things that were required to make him a nextList.
The research program that I'm going to describe to you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive, instantly responsive to every action you had, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute.
So in December 1968, a young engineer known as Douglas Engelbart took stage at a conference center and gave a 90-minute presentation that would change the world of computing from that point on. This is something that later has been known as the mother of all demos. During those 90 minutes, engineers sat baffled in the room, experiencing things they had never seen before. He was working on a screen using a device, wooden device that he called a mouse, to navigate windows on the screen. He was communicating with a co-worker of his who was in a different location, miles away, and they were cooperating, working together on the same things. He was editing text live on screen, loads of things that no one had seen before, and this was something that Ted Nelson was aware of before this time, because he had seen some of these technologies at Xerox PARC Research Center and in Stanford, where this presentation was given before this time. Even how groundbreaking this thing was, Ted Nelson was not very impressed, because he did not see this as the same vision he had for technology. Ted Nelson wanted technology not only to recreate the experiences that we already had in the workplace and the office, he wanted this to change the way we looked at information entirely. So, the same time as Douglas Engelbart gave his mother of all demos demo, Ted Nelson got the research funds to start a project at Harvard University, where he was at the moment. So this is how the mother of all demos editing was. One changed the text on screen using commands and having a sort of interactive experience with editing text. Ted Nelson was at the time reading a book by William Burroughs called The Soft Machine. Has anyone ever read anything by William Burroughs? William Burroughs is one of the beat writers, and he had a very special style of writing that would also inspire musicians such as David Bowie and many other people. The way he worked with text is that he would have what he had written, and then he would cut it up word by word and rearrange that. So his editing process was very different from the way that you were taught to write. But through this, you actually kept all the things. The context was still there, and the words that weren't used were just pushed aside. So everything was tracked. And this inspired Ted Nelson's first software project known as Jot. And it was a text editor. It was very similar to the one that had been presented in the mother of all demos, in the sense that you would have text on the screen and you could go back, change the text, and so forth. Exactly the same thing from the user experience point of view. What was the interesting thing about this one was how information was stored. So during the 1960s, most data was stored on tapes. And tape storage was the medium for Ted Nelson's Jot editor as well. But he would never rewind the tape. He would never go back. So whenever you made a change, that change was appended to the end of the tape, describing the change that was made. So you preserved the entire history of everything. And if you think about this, this is very similar to the systems we use today, like Git for source code versioning. We store everything and keep track of the history. This was Ted Nelson's first major innovation. Now, the Jot editor, Jot is short for juggler of text. And the concept of text was always central to what Ted Nelson was doing. In 1965, he wrote a paper for a conference in Cleveland with a very peculiar title. This one is called A File Structure for the Complex, the Changing, and the Indeterminate, which was basically describing the storage format that he used in his JOT text editor. The paper opens with a phrase, the hypertext. That's the word he coined to describe the way he thought about text. So this, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, is the first time ever the word hypertext is used. It's something that we use every day today. Ted Nelson, 1965, that's where this comes from. But Ted Nelson also had another mission that was dearly important to him, because he had been working in computing for a while, and he found that the entire computer world was gate-kept by the scientists, researchers, and the engineers working in that, keeping regular people out of this. So the scientists were the only ones knowing the secret codes and language of the computers, and they spoke a language that no one except themselves would understand. As Ted Nelson said, they would spatter you with unintelligible answers, and they would not let you near their computers because they were only for authorized users. So how on earth would this be available to regular people, and how would people experience what computers were all about and the power and creativity that could be unleashed if you had access to a computer? And as a reaction to this, Ted Nelson writes the book Computer Lib in 1974. It's a self-published book, and he has written this on a typewriter, of course cut it up with scissors and glued it together on paper, very much in the style of DIY, and this book is special because this is a book that explains in very simple terms how a computer works and what it can be used for, and it's an interesting read. This is maybe one of the best introductory textbooks on computers ever written. You can find copies of this online. It has been republished by Microsoft in the 1980s. And if you want an original copy, there are some on eBay, but they're pricey. On the back side of this book, you would find an entirely different book. So if you turned it over, you would find the book Dream Machines, which is where parts of the title of this talk comes from. So Dream Machine was an entirely different book. This was a vision of what Ted Nelson thought that computers should be. And his visions for what a computer could be was very different from what the priesthood of the Church of Computing thought at the time. So in the book Dream Machines, Ted Nelson describes a world that is very much inspired by a poem called The Kubla Khan. It's a poem from 1816 written by Coleridge, and in this poem Coleridge describes this underworld with a mythical castle that is always in the distance, and the name of that castle is Xanadu. And Xanadu would be the name for the project he talks about in this book that would also be his lifelong project. Now, because computers weren't available to people, like the home computing revolution was still 10 years away, but Ted Nelson really wanted computers to be available to people. So he envisioned something like a McDonald's franchise, that you would have Xanadu cafes around the world where you could go in with your friends and family and sit down and use a computer that connected into a world-spanning library of knowledge and information, where everything was hypertext, where you would not only be able to read and discover things, but where you also could write and contribute to this ever-growing body of knowledge that was there. So he was not thinking about this as technology at all. It was supported by computers and technology, but for him this was more about creating a new form of literature, and through that having a system that liberated human creativity and made that available to everyone in the world. And he, as I said, had this as his lifelong big project. So from publishing Dream Machines, he worked on this continuously. In 1981, he published another book called Literary Machines. And in the same way as Computer Lib, he self-printed this thing. It was done on a silkscreen machine by hand that was using vinegar as a solid to print things. So his home reeked of vinegar for weeks while he was printing this book. But this book is really a specification for what Xanadu is. And in this book, he describes some very basic concepts for what this information would look like and how it would be brought together. Now, already in the mother of all demos, the concept of links between documents had been shown, but these were one-way links. Ted Nelson realized that these links should probably be bidirectional. So every document or every fragment of text, down to every single word or character, would have a permanent address and be identifiable. And you could create links and connections between everything. And you could follow these links both ways. So if you were at a piece of information, you could track back to whatever other pieces of information linked to that as well. That is what Google came up with for the PageRank algorithm that was the foundation of that empire 20, 30 years later. This was all part of the basic concepts of Ted Nelson's Xanadu vision. He also had the concept of something he called transclusion. And when we produce text, we do copy and paste things a lot, which is really quoting someone else's work. And Xanadu would have this built in. So when you quoted something, that would have a reference back to the original material so that you can see what the source was, and vice versa. Tying information together and creating this meta-network that would enrich information as well. And like he stored this on tape, there would be versions, historical versions of everything. So there would be a record of every single variety of any sort of information that had ever existed available to track. And on any piece of information, you could annotate and add your own comments to things. So in a sense, the entire thing was a social network built in. And you could see other people's annotations as well. So it would be a very good vessel for sharing information and bringing the world of information together. Now, in Ted's life, events sort of happened that do not necessarily fit with his plan for things. And in 1984, the Apple Macintosh was released. And the Apple Macintosh was a fulfillment of the Engelbert, mother of all demos, vision. Finally, you would have that experience of using a mouse, having information in Windows, having applications that would allow you to edit things as you saw them on screen, and it would also be on every single desk in offices, and you would even have them at home. So Ted Nelson being Ted Nelson, he was not really impressed by this either, because this was not the thing that he was thinking about. Apple were still just recreating the experience that we had from the office before. They even called the thing on the screen a desktop. And it would be cluttered with documents that were all over. It did not have the structure and the connections that Ted Nelson was looking for. So we are now in the mid-'80s. We are 10 years on from when he published Computer Lib. He has been working on the Xanadu vision for 10 years, but there is still no product. But there are people who believe in what he does. And he has the funding to keep on building things. And whenever Ted Nelson bumps into a challenge, he goes into his past and tries to find a solution there. And he grew up in close to Hollywood, with Hollywood parents, and film has been a passion of his all along. So in looking for a solution to the problem, he thinks about in what ways does film work? Well, film is a continuous strip of pictures, and you can take scissors and cut them up and glue them together to change how things are stored. So taking the multimedia experience of the Apple Macintosh, he now envisions that Xanadu will not only be about text, it will be about any form of media, and you will be able to connect it together in the same ways that you would do with everything else. And he starts building this as a storage system called Zigzag, which he keeps on doing, and another bump in the road comes up. Because in 1984, Netscape releases their first browser, and suddenly something called the internet becomes available to the general public and the entire wide world. And this and Tim Berners-Lee's research obviously builds on the ideas that Ted Nelson had. There is one thing in this that is a Ted Nelson invention that he actually gets credited for. It's the back button. Because the concept of backwards navigation was something that he already described in his Jot text editor. But Tim Berners-Lee is really the one who gets the credit for creating HTML, HTTP, and bringing hypertext to the world. And so this is a sad story. But let's look at what this timeline could have looked like. So let's go back to the early 1960s. When Ted Nelson coins the word hypertext. Instead of thinking about how he's going to evolve this into a product that can be sold as Xanadu, maybe instead he could start thinking about other things that were going on at the same time, with things like networking, and trying to come up with the protocols that he would later describe. So let's imagine that we have something like, call it the hypertext linking protocol, that brings together the different forms of information that we have. When we then come to the 1970s, and Ted Nelson publishes his Computer Lib book, which I still think is absolutely great. He needs to do that, because that is a great introduction to computing and something that brings computing to everyone. But instead of holding these ideas for himself and sitting there writing these books, maybe he could work on some specifications that could become standards, as they were doing for networking, as they were doing for every single piece of computing that would become the ARPANET and later on the internet. Because then maybe when he publishes Literary Machines, that could be the authoritative volume of how to build this network. And then when Tim Berners-Lee creates the World Wide Web, he would already have the blueprint and the recipe for what to do. So we would not have those one-way simple links. We would have two-way links and all of those lovely things that Ted Nelson had described. And when Mosaic is released as the first ever web browser, that would not be a web browser, but maybe a hypernet browser, which would be more of the thing that Ted Nelson was building. This would change things along history, because when the web is shaken, or the internet is shaken up by the massive piracy and things that are happening during the early Y2K period, we would already have the things that Ted Nelson had described, like trans-copyright, which is the thing that he called transclusion, where you references or use someone else's work with micropayments built in. So you could just listen to or download anyone's song or other intellectual property, and you would have small payments being made to the authors or the artists or whatever. So that thing would never have happened. And 10 years later, when we come to the social media area, and Nelson said about social media that humanity is trapped within systems of invisible walls, specific conventions created by hidden techies, sometimes long ago and never questioned since. Because this is what happened when we got Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. They want the entire internet to be their own privately owned ecosystem. In some developing countries, you get a phone with Facebook pre-installed and no browser. So to some people, Facebook is the entire online world. Well, with Ted Nelson's system, you would have the social connection built into the entire thing, because his vision was very much about bringing people together around culture, around all of the things that make us human. So we could be in a very different place. And we could go to a very different place, because if we look into the crystal ball and the world today, what could things look like if we listen to Ted? Well, one of the big challenges online today is misinformation. People are trying to fool us every single day. We have fake news. We are unsure about what we can trust and so forth. The idea of trust and authority was built into the sanity system, with everything being tied with bidirectional links back. So it would be really easy to identify whether or not this was trustworthy or not. In addition, you had the community feature of annotations and everyone being able to provide context and comments for things. So you would have fact-checking and all of those interactions built into the system. So that would be probably part of the fabric itself. Think about things like a 14-year-old boy sitting in his bedroom and wanting to create hip-hop music. And hip-hop music is usually created by taking little samples of previous works and bringing them together in new ways. So let's say that he wanted to use some of the big jazz classics, sample those and bring those into his own song. Well, you could do that now, but it's really difficult to release that bit of music, because you have to go through the entire legal process of clearing the samples and getting agreements in place and so forth. If we had the micropayments that Nelson had thought about quoting things, that would already be a solved problem, and it would be easier for people to publish that sort of thing, and people would get paid, and things would be fair. Speaking of fairness, we have these alien life forms that move across the entire world of information today, sucking up everything that has ever been produced by a human and then recreating it, and it's the thing called artificial intelligence. It's probably one of the biggest thefts of intellectual property that has ever happened in the history of mankind. And if we had the idea of every single bit of information linking back to the original source, we could actually do that magical things that generative AI does in a very fair way, where whenever a little bit of information had been used, we could give credit to the original author, and in the times when we actually need to pay for things, that could also be part of everything. So these basic ideas that Ted Nelson had would actually make the online world a much better place than it is now. And Ted Nelson is an old man today, and he is in that phase of life where he's thinking about and reflecting upon the life that he has had. As Gladys Haber wrote about in this book, just take a look at the cover and see if you can see it.
It's been very lonely, but I've been absolutely sure of what I've been doing all the time. So one of the main definitions of paranoia is believing what nobody else believes. So one cure is for the patient to change his mind and believe what the rest of the world believes. That is the low road. The other, by which I hope to cure myself, is to persuade everybody else. And then I will no longer be paranoid, but recognized as having been right all along.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Ted Nelson himself. He is 89 years old now. He is still working on his Xanadu project, and he still believes in this, and I think we have Ted to thank for many of the best ideas that ever came to computing. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk, and have a lovely rest of the conference. Thank you.